Welcome to Concussion Talk Podcast, episode 140. And I'm talking to editor-in-chief of Journal of Neurotrauma, Dr. Dave, or Dr. He told me to call him Dave Brody, but I'll say Dr. David L. Brody. And but first, I will for him, I'll just do the sponsor, HeadCheck Health. So, HeadCheck Health bridges gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada. Rely on HeadCheck to improve communication and optimize care. Visit hedgehealth.com for more. And also, just please follow me on social media. All of it is at Concussion Talk. My website, and my website is concussiontalk.com. And that's where you can buy this shirt, which actually Dave really just mentioned he would like to buy one. And I think that's amazing. And so follow me and follow, rate, subscribe, review wherever you find podcasts and good pods. And without further ado, I'll talk to Dr. David Brody, or Dave Brody. To call you Dave. So can you just please, first of all, talk about I'll get you to introduce more of yourself later, but first of all, the Journal of Neurotrauma. What is it? Who is your target audience? And what subjects are you covering? Saying you're not necessarily latest issue, but generally, what subjects do you cover?
Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the invitation to be on the podcast, first of all. And thanks for a good question. So Journal of Neurotrauma is published once a month and we've been in business for quite a number of years. It's the only major scientific publication that specializes in neurotrauma. It covers brain injury, including concussion, and spinal cord injury, and related topics. The target audience is mostly scientists and clinicians, although a good number of people from the general public read it as well. Very well-educated members of the general public also read it. We publish original research papers. We publish review articles covering a broad range of topics. We publish letters to the editor. We publish opinions and editorials. And we publish the abstracts from the National Neurotrauma Society meeting, which is held once a year, and it's sort of the main forum for our family. I mean, we're a family of scientists and clinicians, and we get together for a family reunion once a year. It's called the National Neurotrauma Society Symposium, and we publish the abstracts and proceedings from that. Yeah.
So, I guess, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, so it's a great publication. It's been a lot of fun. I've just recently joined as the editor-in-chief.
So you just joined?
Yeah, I joined about 2 years ago. John Pavlischak was the editor-in-chief for many, many, many years, and he retired recently. And he kind of put his hands on my shoulder and said, "Dave, would you take this over?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I will." Yeah, because he was one of my mentors.
So I guess it's a good segue into where did he find you about your and know you'd be interested in doing being the editor-in-chief of this journal? So what is your background, and why are you interested in, say, brain injury?
Yeah, so I'm a neurologist, and I take care of patients with traumatic brain injuries, including concussions, and more severe traumatic brain injuries, even including all the people with disorders of consciousness and coma and vegetative state and things like that. And I have been interested in the field for now about 22 years. And my laboratory has done a lot of research in the topic on brain imaging and sports concussion and traumatic brain injury and the risk of Alzheimer's disease and new MRI methods, and a lot of work in the field. So John Pavlischak asked me to do it, I think, because in the kind of the previous era of Journal of Neurotrauma, most of the research being published was on animal models of traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury. But in recent years, we've been really shifting towards clinical studies, human patients with imaging, human patients with blood biomarkers, studies of sports concussions, studies of military brain injuries, and I've worked a lot on that topic as well. And so John, I think, was interested in having someone who understood both the clinical aspects of traumatic brain injury care and also the scientific aspects of brain injury care. And so that's something that I like, the interface going back and forth
Yeah.
from bench to bedside and back to the
Yeah.
bench and things like that.
Yeah,
Now,
I've although my site is called Concussion Talk, I had a more severe brain injury, 3. So I'm kind of more interested in the just the whole the severe brain injury. I was in a coma for 2 weeks, and I had to learn to walk and talk and all that stuff again. Use my left side a bit more, but what trends have you noticed? I know you said it moved to animal markers in the good old days. I guess mostly it was doing animal studies. But what have you noticed? What trends have you noticed? Is there like a emerging trend? I know it's probably more towards concussion, but are there any trends toward the type of studies? What scientists are looking for, what they found, and what's clinically known?
yeah, that's a great question. So there used to be a much greater focus on animal models, as I mentioned, and there was a lot of focus on more severe forms of traumatic brain injury, as as you mentioned. Those are still really important. We still do a lot of great animal studies, publish a lot of great animal studies. We still publish a lot of studies focused on severe brain injuries, but about 80% of the traumatic brain injuries in the world are concussion. And so
Yeah.
we've been focusing on concussions in humans and also animal models of concussion. There's one thing that's been a really interesting trend is there's been a lot of interest in repeated concussive and sub-concussive injuries, such as are sustained sometimes by professional athletes, football players and boxers and hockey players and soccer players, as well as military service members who are exposed to multiple head injuries during their military service. So there's been new animal models in that domain, and then also clinical studies of people that have had multiple repetitive head injuries, focusing on the short-term effects and also focusing on the long-term neurodegenerative effects.
Yeah, the CTE, and
CTE, yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
CTE.
Because actually, my last podcast, which was now last week, but this podcast will to come out on the 20th, so it'll be on December 2nd, 2 weeks ago. There's a rugby player from Wales, Welsh rugby player, Alex Popham, who's been diagnosed with dementia, and he's my age, which is 42. He's 43, but and so just that the whole the Alzheimer's, as you said, the long term effects of all of these sub-concussive hits are just in contact sports, or just not necessarily in contact sports. It's not necessarily only there, but it's everywhere. But what I was going to ask you about was all these trends are fascinating to me. I find these really interesting. But yeah, one thing definitely cannot study, although the trend is moving towards more like concussive injuries, but and away from say more severe traumatic brain injury. But in animal models, you can't study say mental health as you can in human studies. So human models. So have you noticed? Is there any linkage you can see, or do you know that between mental health and brain injury that you find important?
Oh, that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
The links between mental health and brain injury, Nick, are incredibly important. And in fact, in some of the studies that my own lab published, including in the Journal of Neurotrauma, before I was editing the Journal of Neurotrauma, I published my own studies in the Journal of Neurotrauma.
Yeah.
We found that one of the strongest correlates of overall quality of life after military concussion, whether it was from a blast injury or an impact or a combination of both, was the severity of the depression and severity of the post-traumatic stress symptoms after the brain injury. So when my patients ask me, is it the brain injury or the mental health?
It's
I
both.
say, yes, it's
Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
And it's 1 + 1 makes 4.
Yeah.
It's worse than the sum of the parts,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Which actually, because in early October, I was on the podcast was Dr. Richard Tedeschi I don't know if runs the Boulder Crest, so he helps. Doesn't run it. It's Josh Gilbert runs it, but he is a big part of it of the post traumatic growth, which is a thing that I found this is so fascinating. I found I could relate to a lot of stuff he was saying. But have you found any sort of do you find people study more the mental health aspect of it, or just more the say the biomarkers, the more clinical as in is getting better and getting them back and getting their material fixed, their anatomy fixed, as opposed to their brain. Have you noticed?
I think both. I mean, I think we're doing both.
Yeah,
Honestly, I think the way to go for we're doing a lot of both in the sense that we do great studies, we publish great studies on biomarkers,
yeah,
and the biomarkers are really important because let's say somebody comes in and they know they've had that hit on the head, but they're not really sure how severe a brain injury they've had. I
right,
mean, they don't have their scans are negative. And they're having all this mental health concerns, depression and post-traumatic stress and anxiety and irritability. And they don't really know whether those mental health concerns are related to their brain injury or not. Then sometimes the biomarker helps. Sometimes they see a biomarker and the levels are very high and they say, oh, wow, I guess I did have a brain injury. Or they see a scan, one of our advanced MRI or advanced PET imaging scans, and they say, oh, wow, I really did have a brain injury. So maybe that's why I'm having so much
yeah,
irritability and so much depression. And they may approach it a little bit differently than they would as a regular, there's no such
yeah,
thing, but
yeah,
a non-brain injury related
yeah,
mental health concern. They may see a neurologist in addition to their
right,
psychiatrist, or they may do brain injury rehabilitation in addition to their cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think, people always ask me, well, what should I treat first, the traumatic brain injury or the mental health concern? And I say both. You need to get
yeah,
both of them treated together.
yeah.
So
Because when I was doing the first, I was doing probably within the first year of my was doing this podcast, I was interviewing somebody from the university in Ontario who was studying blood biomarkers for concussion, and I was wondering. I said I'd never heard this before. This is in 2015, 2016, and but now her biomarkers are a big thing. So, but that's just still like nascent phases. It's still very early on. So, but do doctors like neurologists like yourself to take these biomarkers to be proof or to be or well, first of all, I guess you kind of combine that with all what are biomarkers and what are the biomarkers looking at.
yeah, no, thank you, Nick. I mean, so what do people mean by a biomarker? A biomarker is really anything that you can measure biologically, like an objective measurement.
Yeah.
And that could be you draw some blood and you measure some proteins in the blood. It could be an imaging study like an MRI or a PET scan. It could be a physiological biomarker like the way your pupils constrict to light or the way your eyes move. Those are all biomarkers. They're objective biological markers of brain injury. Sometimes when people say biomarkers, what they mean a shorthand for blood biomarkers or fluid
Yeah.
biomarkers, like you might mean saliva biomarker or cerebrospinal fluid biomarker or blood biomarker or sweat biomarker. So fluid biomarkers are especially attractive because they're so easy. It's easy to acquire those fluids.
How do you
And
acquire cerebrospinal fluid?
cerebrospinal fluid, you get that with a lumbar puncture.
So it's like if it's surgery, then okay.
Not a surgery. It's just a
No,
really small, thin needle that
really?
goes in the lower back.
Huh.
And it's super easy. People are scared
No,
of getting,
they're saying.
but it's nothing to be scared of.
Really? No,
So in the United
that's
States, we're
cool.
scared of it. But like in Europe, my colleagues in Europe do cerebrospinal fluid acquisitions, lumbar punctures on hockey players right straight out of
Oh,
concussion.
oh,
And it's nothing to be afraid of. It's very straightforward.
good,
Um,
good.
so yeah, we do it all the time. It's really no big deal. It has gotten a bad reputation, which is
Yeah,
unfortunate because it's really very useful.
yeah.
I've had one myself, so
Oh,
I volunteered to have one just to kind
oh,
of demonstrate that it was no big deal.
yeah. Oh,
Um,
sorry. I interrupted you when you talk about biomarkers and
oh
then
no, not at all. Don't
how
worry.
much
You asked a really good question. Yeah,
how
you asked
much
a really good
neurologists
question.
do neurologists like really take those as proof of concussion, or do you take them as more indication that potentially the person may need to do some more tests, but we'll see kind of thing, or is it more of a
It has to be in the right context. So
yeah,
like, let's say the diagnosis of concussion or brain injury or traumatic brain injury is a clinical diagnosis. There has to be an acute event, something has to happen to you, a car accident or a fall or a blast or a sport hit. You have to have an acute physical force applied to the brain. And then you have to have some neurological consequences, either unconscious or amnesia or some other change in neurological status. You remember the fencing response, and you remember the people off balance and things like that. So some kind of change in neurological status. So, but sometimes people have those things and you're still not quite sure. And so the blood biomarker can be really useful for determining whether you have had, maybe there's nothing, maybe you were fine, or maybe it's really bad and you need to get zipped over and get a CT scan right away. Maybe it's more severe than you thought, and so you need a CT scan. And so it's always interpreted in the context of the clinical story, because these blood biomarkers or fluid biomarkers can go up even in other conditions. So if you have a small stroke, or if you have Alzheimer's disease, or if you have multiple sclerosis or Lou Gehrig disease, some of the same biomarkers go up. So they're not specific for a traumatic brain injury. They just say that the brain has been damaged.
Indication that the brain has been traumatized.
That's right. The brain has been traumatized, but lots of things can cause the brain to be traumatized. And so you have to understand it in the context of the clinical scenario. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah,
Hopefully it makes sense to listeners as well. And so you also, this is kind of away from what we're talking about. Do you yourself publish in or submit papers to the Journal of Neurotrauma?
I do, yes. It's the best journal for the field. And so when I have two really terrific deputy editors, Alex Faladka and Dalton Dietrich, and if I'm publishing myself, or if one of my colleagues is publishing, somebody that I have a conflict of interest with, then I ask my two deputy editors to handle it, and I stay out of it. So no conflicts of interest. So yeah, I actually just had a paper accepted relatively recently.
And what topics do you submit on? Do you talk, and obviously brain injury, but I mean, what topics brain injury?
Yeah, I mean, so recently we've been doing some studies about the US military, about blast injuries in the US military. And we've been doing some studies about advanced MRI methods, better ways to take pictures of the brain. And we published pretty recently a new treatment for depressive symptoms related to traumatic brain injury. So we took some of my patients from my clinic and we applied a new method called transcranial magnetic stimulation to the brain to try to treat their symptoms of depression. And it worked pretty well. We published that in Journal of Neurotrauma.
Is that used in like epilepsy, or there's some of that used in epilepsy?
Yep. It can be used in epilepsy. It can be used in headache. It can be used in obsessive compulsive disorder. But the actual FDA approval is for depressive symptoms.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so just I'm just getting more inside baseball on this blast injuries, but is that just waves? You ran the concussion range, or is it just when you get knocked back, or hit a wall, or your head?
You mean you're talking about a blast injury?
Yeah.
Yeah. So usually it's both. So usually the blast wave hits you and it moves through your brain and can stretch and damage the brain.
Wow.
And also the person gets thrown across and smacked up against a wall. And maybe the vehicle that they're in will crash and they'll hit their head.
Yeah.
And maybe a building collapses around them.
So you're trying to find out what the worst impact is, or is like the blast any less severe than, say, I guess it's hard to tell because there's different severities of crashes against your head hitting something, but how severe is the blast? Can get the waves hitting your brain?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually don't know the answer to that, and it's really hard to figure out.
Exactly.
Because it's really hard to figure out. We've mostly been focusing on the kind of the whole package, the whole combination, and what's wrong with the folks and how can we fix them? How can we help them get better, and tracking their outcomes over a longer period of time. So we kind of take the whole package all at once. Now this is a good place for animal studies, and some of the animal studies are helping sort that out about how much is effective a blast and how much is effective an impact injury. But the pure blast injuries where there's nothing except for blast are very, very rare in humans. So it's pretty hard to tell how that goes. Now, one thing that is going on that's pretty interesting is that a lot of military service members who are practicing firing heavy weapons, they get exposed to a relatively modest blast, not enough to knock them out or cause a really serious brain injury, but they feel a little stunned and a little off balance and a little not quite right after they fire these weapons with that blast. And especially if they fire a lot of them, if they've been firing a lot of these weapons in training. And so there's a big study that's ongoing. We don't have results yet, but there's a big study that's ongoing to try to figure out what the long-term effects of those repeated sub-concussive blast exposures are going to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can do a lot of those, like when I'm sure training, you can do like thousands of hundreds of these, and just do some potentially.
Yeah, I mean, the question is it kind of analogous to the big hits that football players take when they just get hit after hit after hit? Each one they do okay, they recover from each one okay, but if they get hundreds or, like you said, maybe thousands, are they gonna not be okay?
Yeah, that's just a really interesting and important topic. Interesting subject.
Military is really interested in that.
I noticed I looked on the website of the Journal of Neurotrauma, and you have a lot of contributors and people who work on the editors in different countries, in Europe and Canada, in South America, or not. I don't see. Sorry, I'm sure there's South America. I'm sure there's all over the world. But have you noticed that there's different focus in different countries, different areas of the world? Is there like a different between, say, your editor in China? Would he look at different subjects than, say, your editor in Germany?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's a great question, Nick. I mean, so we really do think the Journal of Neurotrauma is an international journal. It's a whole international family of neuroscience and neurotrauma researchers. One of the things I've tried to do is to encourage more papers and more editorial team members from Europe and South Africa and China. And so I have to say, China is the big growth area. The number of neurotrauma papers coming out of China is really going up. It was not a particularly popular topic in China 10 years ago, and now it's really very popular. The Chinese researchers are publishing a lot of good papers. Higher quality every year is better than the year before. And one of the things that has been going on in China, which is really neat to see, is really large studies with large sample size, large numbers of people, because in their system, they have specialized hospitals that see a lot of neurotrauma patients, plus just enormous cities at a scale that's unimaginable here in the United States or in Europe. So some really nice, good, powerful, large studies coming out of China. Very, very good quality studies. Better every year. There's also a lot of good animal work coming out of China. A lot of good mechanistic animal work that Dr. Gao, our editor, has been helping to refine and promote. So, we were talking about there's not as much animal studies as there used to be. Well, there are still plenty of animal studies, and they're very good, and they're good quality coming out of China. Europe has been doing terrific work. Our European colleagues have been doing really great work. One of the things I really like about the European groups is that there's a group called Center TBI, which is a multinational, multidisciplinary group where they publish studies where they have many, many countries in Europe that are all teaming up together to do research in neurotrauma. And so you get to see, the whole span of neurotrauma research across the whole continent. And so I'm really proud of our European colleagues for that organizational activity. And we love publishing those papers from Center TBI. And, lots of great lots of great neurotrauma research all over Europe.
So is there say a trend in, say, mentioned China now? Is there a trend in China as to where TBIs are most prevalent, and what the long-term effects, or I don't know, long-term, they don't have long-term analysis done yet, but I mean, what are the longer term symptoms, and what are the areas where they see more TBIs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. So first of all, it's all over China. I counted up, the numbers of centers that are publishing good work in China. There's
Yeah.
46 different centers. I found at least 46 different centers in China that are doing neurotrauma research. So it's really all over China. Just about every city, every academic medical center in China is doing
Yeah.
neurotrauma research. So yeah, it's really all over the place. As far as mechanisms, I mean, as you know, China has industrialized very quickly, and it has a
Yeah.
lot more drivers and a lot more cars and a
Oh,
lot more traffic. So
yes.
there's a lot more traffic accidents related
Okay.
to trauma, related neurotrauma in China. And also the Chinese population is getting older. And so as older individuals are having more falls. And so it's actually becoming a lot like neurotrauma in the United States and Europe, where it's mostly motor vehicle accidents
Yeah.
and falls. The one exception, I mean, the two differences, right, is that China does not have a very active, has not been at war. The Chinese have not
Yeah.
been at war. And so they don't have the blast related war injuries that we have.
Yeah.
And there's not as much sports related concussion. There's not a lot of vigorous contact sports,
Yeah.
collision sports with sport related concussions in China. So those we have not seen really.
Okay. But
Yeah.
you do see them in some in Europe, and like soccer and rugby and
Yeah.
those sports. But
Definitely in rugby and soccer in the United States and in Canada and in Australia and in Europe. Yeah, we definitely see sports related concussion. Sweden, for example, is really strong in
really,
publishing great sport related concussion
um,
papers on hockey players. Those some of the best papers that we've published in Journal of Neurotrauma have been Swedish hockey players.
wow.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you the have you noticed there's like a trend of say of where most concussion, you said, because 80% of the brain injuries are concussions. So, and you'd say, what is there a trend towards what area that is, what mechanism is on the rise and what's on decline in that area?
Yeah, I mean that's hard to say. I don't know really, but I mean
Yeah,
concussion, everything causes concussion,
yeah,
right? I mean,
yeah.
the most common thing is, again, is car accidents.
Okay, it's just you.
And the second most common is falls.
Right.
And then
No
sports.
matter where you are.
Yeah. And then sports is in there and assault, unfortunately. One of
Yeah.
the areas, I'm glad you mentioned that because one of the areas that we don't even know how common it is intimate partner violence.
Yes, but she did a podcast on that last year, and I think that we're earlier this year is or last year, anyway, last year. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just think that's just very important. That's really unknown. I know there's a team in BC and in Toronto that study that. Unfortunately, that area that's unknown and sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. You were saying.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, we just started publishing papers about that topic recently. We haven't had much in the past. We'd like to publish more on that. We actually, I mean, I think it's a really underexplored topic, and I think we think we need to do a lot more work in that area, but we just don't know. So yeah, we'd like to see a lot
Yeah.
more papers in that domain.
Yeah, no, and I know there's a researcher in Angela Colantonio. I think I'm not saying it correctly, but in Toronto. And there's one in Harvard that's also does a lot of work in the area. And I think that's very important. Of course, there's Pink Concussion. She does a lot of work on females and brain tree. And so I think that's part too. But what areas have you, so I encourage those people to reach out to or submit their articles if they see that has some to Journal of Neurotrauma,
Yep,
and
absolutely.
they want to publish more and get that information out there. I think it's very important. So so you said so for your you studied a lot of U.S. Army mechanism ministry like blasts and do you recognize do you study only training or recreational combat or both, or do you think one is more not say culpable, but one maybe it may be better, I guess, easier, not better, but easier to study a training injury than a than an injury from a war zone, because the PTSD, or is that true? Or am I saying that making that?
Yeah, those are good questions. So certainly when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were very active, we were seeing a lot of concussions from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We did some research in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. A lot of the folks will be being evacuated from Iraq and Afghanistan to Landstuhl, and we did a lot of research at Landstuhl, Germany. We did some research at 3 different centers in Afghanistan, and that was really interesting. Now in 2022, there's not that many concussions, not that many injuries occurring overseas. So most of the concussions that we're studying now in the military are occurring during training. There's always been a lot of concussions during training, but that's where the kind of a biggest focus is right now. And in addition, the sub-concussive blast injuries during training are another big area of focus. So yeah, that's I would say that's probably the area where we're going now. I mean, we certainly hope that we are not going back to a wartime footing, but if we do, we'll be relatively well prepared now with the experiences that we've had to do that kind of research. So yeah, anyway, we'll see what the future brings.
I suppose finally the safety in these long-term effects of brain even mild traumatic or even subconcussive hits. I assume we think now they require, because we assume now they're only observable after only diagnosed CT after someone's died, and which, I mean, you'd think with Alzheimer's being able to observe, let's say, Alzheimer's and dementia and the plaque before while the people are obviously living, think that maybe there's some way to get to recognize the CT in a living person, but of course that's study. But these, I assume it's otherwise just a longitudinal studies of like 20 years, 10 years, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes longitudinal studies. So, like, for example, my colleagues are doing the 10-year follow-up of some of the people that we saw in Launchtool, and that's pretty interesting to see those long-term studies. There's been some really terrific long-term studies from the Vietnam War, where we're seeing, again, the long-term follow-up of people that were injured in the Vietnam War. And those are pretty fascinating studies to see those long-term impacts, those long-term effects. Yeah. But even though we can't diagnose CTE in a living person right now,
Yeah,
we can still treat the
symptoms.
concerns that people may have. So like I'll say to, like, I've seen lots of national football players, league players, retired football league players, and I'll say, look, I don't know whether you have CTE or not, and I'm not in any rush to find out, because your brain, you're still using your brain.
Yeah.
But you're having trouble sleeping after your head injuries, I can treat your trouble sleeping.
Okay.
You're having headaches, I can treat your headaches.
Right.
You're having trouble concentrating, I can treat your attention deficit. You're having problems with your mood, I can treat your mood problems. So I don't know whether you have CTE or not, but I can help you get you better.
That certainly be encouraging to a lot of people. And so what? Finally, it's my final question. It's still, I know you can't really say which paper you like the most, because your editor in chief can't really be biased that way. But like, what what exciting trends? What exciting? Say, I'm trying to find out right way to say exciting trends in traumatic brain injury research, but like, is there something on the horizon that you find to be very, very exciting, or is it all just a mess of, not a mess, but like a conglomeration of exciting new research coming out?
I think the thing that's most important to me as editor-in-chief is quality.
Yeah.
So we're pushing hard for rigor, reproducibility, and transparency. It doesn't matter what field you're working on. We want the best quality science that we can do. We want to make sure that the science is done with the highest standards of rigor and the highest standards of reproducibility and the highest transparency. So when you read that paper, you know exactly what they did and exactly what they found. It's completely transparent. And we want it to be really reproducible. So if somebody else did that same experiment or somebody else analyzed your same data, they would come to the same conclusion.
Right.
Sadly, a lot of things that are published in the scientific literature turn out to be not that reproducible.
Yeah.
They turn out not to be always exactly correct.
Yeah. That's unfortunate, but
It's
that's
unfortunate,
how
but that's
science works. That's how science works now. Progress is made. So thank you so much for coming on to be on this podcast. And well, seriously, first of all, is there anything else you'd like to say about the paper, about your research, someone else's research, or the journal itself?
You asked a lot of great questions. Submit your best papers on any aspect of traumatic brain injury, and we promise we will give them a fair review. We'll review them quickly, and we will hold you to high standards. We'll send them out for good review. We will help work with you to make your paper better. And by the time you're done, it'll be even better because the reviews are really good. The our editorial team is really helpful. And that's what it's all about, is about advancing knowledge that will improve outcomes for people with neurotrauma.
I think this is very important. Thank you so much. I think that's a great way to end this podcast. And thank you so much. And I think this is wonderful promotion for the journal. And I think I encourage anyone, any researcher or any researcher who wants to publish paper about traumatic brain injury and feel that they should reach out to Journal of Neurotrauma to do so. And I know if you look on the website, they have a lot of great great editors across the world. So there's really, it's not just in North America. It's all over in Europe, it's in Asia, it's in South America, it's in everywhere. So please just reach out to David, and thank you so much, Dave. Dr. David L. Brody, or Dave, thank you, Dave, for being on the podcast.
All right, thanks again.
Thanks.